Thanks everybody for joining. My name is Ben Flatman. I'm the architectural editor at Building Design. I'm delighted to be chairing the first session of WA 100 Live 2024 this morning. Our session today is entitled Global Shifts, Mapping Changing Client Priorities Worldwide. And I'm joined by a wonderful panel. They are Tony Ridderford, Associate Director, Architect, Head of Office and Workplace Sector at Stride Tregowan, Darren Wilson, Associate Architect at White Architecture, and Simon Saint, who is a Principal at Woods Bagot. Before we start with the presentations, I just have a couple of housekeeping matters that I'd like to cover. Firstly, I'm just going to explain how the session will run. Each of our speakers will be given up to 10 minutes to share their overall views on the topic before they come together for a moderated panel discussion, where we'll try to cover off as many of your questions as possible. On that point, please send through any of your questions at any time. We love for our audience to get as involved as possible. Finally, I'd like to let everyone know this session will be available on demand via the same link you joined with an hour after its conclusion. So please feel free to share with any colleagues or rewatch any key points. That's enough from me. And now I'd like to hand over to Tony. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. I will just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's visible for everyone. So thank you all for joining today. As Ben said, my name is Tony Ridderford. I work for a company called Stride Tregowan. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to Stride Tregowan, just to put some context to the presentation. So we have 9 offices across England and Wales with over 300 people. We predominantly work in the UK, although we do have a global client base and global investors into our projects. So my reflections are going to be focused on their priorities within the UK market. We became a B Corp in 2021, the first major UK architectural practice to do so. B Corp requires us to legally embed the balance of profit and purpose into our Articles of Association. We have found that certification really does resonate with our clients, as it demonstrates our commitment to social and environmental performance, and it gives clients confidence that will help them deliver their own equivalent goals. We're architecturally led, but a multidisciplinary practice. We work across all major sectors, and therefore as a practice we interact with a broad range of different clients, from local authorities, government bodies to investment funds and everything in between. For the purposes of this presentation, as it's my area of work, I'm going to concentrate on the private sector and predominantly our commercial client base. Even when we're talking about a UK-based client or project, priorities are always counterbalanced by the global context. Sometimes these are in sync and other times they are in conflict. So what's the immediate context at the moment? Well, it's pretty uncertain. In 2024, more voters than ever in history will head to the polls. At least 64 countries, 49% of people in the world are due to hold global elections. I think this in itself is a very uncertain environment before you factor in all of the other global context. And I have heard kind of fellow consultants, clients describe 2024 as somewhat of a year of lull, a sort of let's sit tight and see what happens situation. We've certainly seen this reflected in some aspects of the industry, in slow or stalled decision making on some projects. AI, well, it's moving so quickly, I don't think any of us can really predict how it will impact the way that humans work and function in the future. As a practice, we've explored AI-based writing, analysis, and visualization tools, but I wouldn't say it's yet penetrated the day-to-day. It hasn't yet started to form part of the briefs or the discussions that we're having with our clients. I think it's more than likely that this will change, but technology is notoriously difficult to predict, as you can see from some of these historical commentators. So I'm going to move on from this one. Climate emergency. 40% of global energy-related carbon emissions come from our buildings, as we all know, and the climate emergency certainly feels more tangible than AI at the moment for me. It's widely recognised by the industry, by our clients, and I'd say it's positively influencing decision making, although I'm sure many people would debate whether that's happening with enough urgency. Individual projects for large corporates and funds now tend to sit within wider established sustainability and carbon guidance and are usually linked to 2030 goals. We're seeing ESG monitoring surveyors becoming more prevalent on large projects. I think the challenge for many of our clients is how to apply the guidance and targets to their operational assets and estates rather than the new construction or the new projects that they're starting. I think it's important to note as well that our clients' priorities sit within the context of regulations, and sometimes the two sit hand in hand, and again, at other times they're in conflict. So the UK planning system operates very differently to some global systems, and we've we've found ourselves often acted as interpreters of it for our global clients. In the past, the building regulations served as the lowest common denominator in many ways, and projects have been exceeding Part L requirements for some time. However, with the minimum energy efficiency standard that came into force last year, which prohibits the letting of any commercial buildings that have an EPC rating less than E, and with that rating rising to C in 2027 and B in 2030, there remains a risk for many of our commercial clients that some of their assets will become stranded. And they are having to put plans in place now. So we're seeing this as a key priority in most client briefs, is that EPC upgrade. The capital available to address performance is very much dependent on the client, their investment strategy, as well as the local market economics. So what we found is it's much more challenging to achieve those upgrades in certain parts of the market in certain regions than in others. Furthermore, there are various 2030 net zero carbon pathways that continue to come our way, and our projects and clients are now being judged against those. And it's difficult to know exactly which one to follow. I think there's so much guidance at the moment on that. I think it's fair to say that in our experience, UK-based institutions are leading the way on that, and the pathways and the targets seem to be more achievable for long-term investors that can take a long-term view on returns. Alongside this, and I won't dwell on it, but the Building Safety Act requires its own presentation in itself. That's obviously having a significant impact on the planning and organisation of residential projects. Just a couple of case studies to finish off. So first of all, this is a project that we've recently completed in Bristol called North Quay House for Legal and General. It's the first phase of a collection of 3 buildings that form a small urban campus. And on this project, Legal and General as the client worked collaboratively with the design team to use carbon as a decision-making consideration, alongside the usual concerns of cost, return on investment, planning risk, and programme. The team explored a whole range of low, medium, and deep refurbishment options, extension and new build, to arrive at a balanced proposal that ultimately improved the aesthetics of the building, the performance, and occupier amenity, whilst retaining large portions of the existing fabric. Examples of life cycle carbon decision making include the use of CLT floor slabs, composite window systems, reclaimed steelwork, and recycled roof tiles. And the client chose these materials despite the fact that sometimes they had an initial cost. And I think that's really telling and representative of the priorities of these types of clients today. To continue progress in this area, I think we need to work towards a more joined up industry, where office buildings are not completed to Cat A level, where landlords and occupiers work together more closely to minimise waste, and start thinking about reusing more whole components rather than just recycling the constituent materials. We also recently worked on another office building called Cole House, a deep refurbishment in Cardiff, which has been used as a case study in the UK Green Building Council's publication Building the Case for Net Zero. And I think this is a good example of where the market conditions were in some ways working against the client's priorities and the client's aspirations, as rental values in Cardiff are £15 less than in Bristol, which is the previous project we just saw. So the success here was really down to the collaborative process, and the client having an open mind as a starting point to arrive at a balanced solution. So in this case, expenditure needed to be really well focused but impactful. And the building was improved from an EPC D to an EPC A. So again, that real clear priority being the minimum energy standards, whilst also being repositioned visually so that it did appear to a new generation of occupiers. And the team calculated here that an equivalent new build would take more than 100 years to pay back the embodied carbon associated with its construction in comparison to the deep refurbishment that we ultimately did. Having said that, one thing we have seen at the end of last year and the start of this year is office values dipping. And as a result, we're seeing a number of our clients consider alternative use classes. So traditional office, commercial focused clients looking at residential. We've undertaken lab enablement studies on business park locations, and we're converting several old office buildings into student accommodation or other residential uses. This is purely from a financial viability perspective, that these are the uses that really are proving to get the returns needed by the clients. And finally, just coming back round to StryTriGlan's B Corp values and how we're seeing that align with our client base. Well, this year, we recently published a positive impact report, and we're seeing that many of our clients are doing the same. It's a growing priority with them. Within public sector tenders, it's very apparent where you're being required to commit to particular social value initiatives and contributions to even have a chance at that tender. In the private sector, we're equally seeing more analysis of social value and positive impact. I think at the front end, this has long been the case. During construction phases, considerate contractor schemes, commitments to apprenticeships, recruitment of local workers, charitable time given. But we're also seeing this priority extend into the operational life of our clients' buildings. So we're seeing much more inclusive community engagement, clients considering outside of their red lines. You know, they're not just thinking of the buildings as isolated islands, that they are having a much more greater vision out into the towns and cities that the buildings are located. Greater public realm investments, community space and activities actually being provided within buildings like offices, which were originally very insular looking. And I guess just to round off, the question is why? You know, why are clients considering, ESG as a top priority, social value as a top priority? Well, obviously, investment is increasingly subject to those benchmarks, but ultimately, I think it's just being recognised as the right thing to do. As upcoming generations enter the workforce, they become occupiers and ultimately they become leaders. I think it's these values that our projects and our clients are being judged upon. So thank you very much, and I'll pass over to the next presentation.
Thanks very much, Tony. Darren, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Darren Wilson from White Architecture. I'm one of the associates speaking from our London studio today. For those of you that don't know White, we are one of Scandinavia's leading architectural firms, and we work with sustainable architecture, design and city planning in an international context for current and future generations. We're an employee-owned company of approximately 700 employees, mostly in Sweden, which is where we were founded. But we also have offices here in London, in the UK, in Stuttgart, in Oslo, and we do work in Canada and East Africa as well. So with sustainability at the centre of everything we do, we've been publishing our annual sustainability reports for well over a decade now. And this covers both social sustainability as well as the environmental sustainability of our products and us as a business. I think when we started doing this, it was a fairly niche activity across the industry and across various sectors. But it's really becoming part of mainstream practice now for so many businesses at so many different walks of life. And I think that's what we're really seeing, that clients and investors are somewhat buying into this vision, and they're both internally reporting on their sustainability and then also in what they're investing in and what they're supporting. That's both public and private sector clients. This is somewhat driven by improved access to finance via ESG funding, which I know has been talked about already by Tony, but also by central government targets and regulation, and that's continuing to drive industries, but also general public awareness and perception of projects. I think now the public is so much more articulate to the issues around sustainability, carbon in buildings, well-being, etc. So I think it was around 5 years ago that we set up our 2030 net zero ambitions. And again, it was possibly a few years ahead of, I think, most of our clients. But now we're increasingly seeing this across all of our clients have some form of climate goal or ambition with their projects going forward. We are aware that our biggest markets, particularly in Sweden, but also in the UK, are experiencing high levels of inflation, and the cost of borrowing has been extreme this year, to say the least. And as such, that's really where we're starting to see the divide between clients that had this kind of short-term reactionary approach or longer-term investments, and those with long-term commitments are looking beyond the immediate situation, beyond the cost of borrowing this year, and being able to look across projects' life cycles and the creation of place and projects going forward. As such, that's actually meaning there's a bit of a shift in our projects, and those that historically were quite risk-averse clients are usually those long-term clients, such as governments, local municipalities, owner-operators. But they really are the ones that are still committing and driving that demand for sustainable buildings, or at least that we're working with. Obviously, that's an area of focus for us, so it's the clients we work with. One of those sectors, for example, is healthcare. We've been doing healthcare projects since the early 50s, not me personally, I'm not that old, but White as a company across Scandinavia, and now more recently in the UK. For the last decade, the conversation has been around how the built environment can have a positive effect on patients' well-being and recovery. And increasingly, that conversation has just shifted to not only the effects of the built environment on the individuals using buildings, but also on wider society and the effects of their new buildings, their new products on the sustainable future. But we do work across a huge variety of sectors, from housing, offices, hospitals, schools, urban planning, landscape, interior design. I'm sure there's many more that I haven't listed there. But I think that the underlying theme of one conversation that we are having with all clients is whenever there's an existing building, they have to justify why to not use that existing building. And those are conversations where if someone didn't like what was there, it was no way financially viable in its current form, it would instantly be dismissed. Whereas now there's a much deeper case needs to be made. We really need to consider what we have as a starting point and where we can build from that, such as here in Nobelberget in Sweden. And we're also seeing an increase in demand for positive energy districts and looking at sort of neighbourhood levels, incorporating both the building services as well as the physical architecture. Conversations that we wouldn't have had many years ago around nature-based architecture. And although the effects of biodiversity on the city is something that has been part of main conversations, we're now able to talk about bio-based materials and natural materials as solutions that could affect the future of our buildings. One such project which I think shows this sort of shift in times and a shift in sort of public consciousness around around sustainability and net zero buildings is the Velindre Cancer Centre in Cardiff. So this is a project which we won 2 years ago in a design competition. It's a 36,000 square metre cancer centre funded by the government as part of an NHS facility. And on page 1 of the brief, it said the importance for nature in this project cannot be overstated. I don't think I'd ever seen a central government brief quite so focused on sustainability, low carbon, and those aspects of design right from the outset. And that thread has continued throughout the project. One of the things supporting this is central government acts, such as a brilliant act in Wales about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015. And this is the long-term impact of all decisions should be considered. Now, this is the kind of government policy that I think many governments over the years have created. Frequently, they're sort of trumpeted when they come out and ignored by industry. But I think increasingly, there are people within government systems and organisations that are seeing these as actual real acts that they should be abiding by and should be considering in everything they do. And this has really underpinned all of our justification throughout the design development. Whenever the pressures come on certain decision making, that actually you set out saying it was this important to your brief. And with projects such as healthcare projects, but also many of our city planning projects and urban regeneration, they are so large that they can be regional economic drivers and a catalyst for climate mitigation and adaptation. In Sweden, we're seeing many projects that are driven by low carbon industries, but very much in a sort of economic sense, in that those industries are now finding new homes in some of the northern, more rural areas of the country and becoming real drivers for that local economy. Now, that said, we're looking at various materials and options for how we can create low carbon buildings. Velindre Cancer Centre here, we have this timber atrium that I think a lot of people see in the images and think it's all about timber. It's really not, and this is not the only material that we're looking at. It's not the solution to everything. We use it a lot in Sweden, but there's context for timber there that makes a lot of sense. In the UK, it doesn't always become the correct material. We are looking at bio-based materials throughout that project. There's a much greater percentage of materials such as clay, lime and hemp blocks, all of which can maybe better suited to a UK climate long-term, potentially. And that's what we're looking at, where we can use these natural materials. And these materials do help provide multiple benefits. So as well as sustainability, there are those social, physical aspects of the materials. Much of them create very environments that people appreciate being in. And a lot of those kind of healthy well-being goals that we were talking about are still so prevalent and actually so integrated with the low carbon materials. And those materials then lead to a natural discussions around biophilic design, bringing nature into our architecture, being close to nature. And these are questions that we're being asked at public consultations about internal courtyards and access to nature, which would never previously have been an interrogation questions from general public, but actually people are so much more aware of their physical environment and then the impact of that physical environment. This doesn't come without challenges. Obviously, environmental product declarations are a wonderful source of understanding about materials, but there also can be a minefield of information that isn't always easy to unpick. We need to have questions around durability, end-of-life use, toxicity, sealants, treatments, cleaning regimes, and then let alone warranties, fire certification, and all of that testing to go through. When using natural bio-based materials, it's obviously causing us lots of challenges. And although many government regulation, I talk about central government regulation driving an aspiration for net zero, the same governments have regulations that limit the use of materials and cause challenges to ensure the right warranties are in place, that we've got the right testing, that it's fully certified, working with whole systems. Locally sourced materials that we are finding can be a wonderful starting point, but so frequently actually processing and manufacturing might end up traveling all the way around the world, because we are very much a global economy with products coming from all over the world within our industry. Time scales and production lines are a challenge as well, and even working through procurement when we're looking at new products and new entries to the market, trying to get that procurement to line up and get the right thing in the right place at the right time can be a challenge, and ensuring that we've got those guarantees and warranties on those new to market products, and considering that, of course, with a low risk tolerance of public sector clients with regards to protection of public money. So we're challenging contemporary design norms. We are seeing a shift in the industry. There's a lot of aspiration behind many of our clients, and now we're working through that, navigating that minefield to deliver those projects.
Thanks very much, Darren. That was very interesting. So handing over to you, Simon.
Morning, everyone. Great to be here. I'll just go through the normal technical minefield of sharing screen. Hopefully that's all coming through okay. Morning. As Ben mentioned, my name is Simon Saint. I'm a principal at Wards Bagot in our London studio. Similar to both Tony and Darren, I'll give a little bit of context about Wards Bagot before diving into some of the other points. We operate we're a global practice. We've got 17 studios around the world and about 1,000 people. And how we underpin some consistency across that without making it too directed is this idea of people architecture, which, similar to what Darren and Tony were talking about, is really thinking about the experience of the people who use it. And I think that's probably the big shift we're seeing from a global perspective from design, is this real move to thinking about how people use the spaces and the interaction. And we use that to underpin our process, so we get consistency in that approach across our global footprint, but without it becoming too consistent in terms of global direction and where that's heading, so every project can still be locally relevant. And that idea of people architecture is really based on the idea that people using the space and enjoying it and having a positive experience, no matter how they're engaging with our projects, that being a positive is what counts to us as good design. So the aesthetics and everything else that go around it follows from that idea that it's the people and the experience that they have that's the important element we have to get right, and then the rest is things that we can build on top of that and take that forward. We, of course, like to think of ourselves as the practice of the future, and we put that in context in terms of thinking about how our role and our input and our expertise can both draw on global inputs, but also draw on things like research and data. We have a scale and an ability to draw on that around the world and then deploy that on projects to help, hopefully, always be improving those experiences from one project to the other. How can we learn from a project in Sydney to apply what we learned there onto a project in London or New York, for example, and how do we actually draw some of that thinking out is actually really tricky, and how you do that in a collaborative, formal yet not overbearing process has been something quite interesting for us to work through over the last probably 10 or 15 years, where we've been really focused on this. Our practice works across architecture, interiors and master planning, and then we have a wider network as part of our business that attaches other disciplines and consulting and other elements to it, which I won't touch on today. As I mentioned, we're a global practice with 17 studios. We're about 1,000 people, so we're at a fairly reasonable scale when it comes to a global practice. And the way we try and leverage that is by that knowledge sharing. We don't have any sort of headquarters. There's no central base, and all of the other studios report to that. Every studio in our network really operates as an individual studio in its local context, in its local market. So in London, we look after the UK and continental Europe. So that means that we have to really understand how our UK market and our European markets are working and what's appropriate for them, but still being able to draw on all of that global knowledge and how we share that across the business. And while, yes, that can sort of lead into conversations around 24-hour working and all of this sort of thing, that's not really where we see the benefit of our global footprint. What we really see is that ability to share that knowledge and find out, well, actually, this exciting thing is happening in Dubai. So how can we take that and apply it to a locally relevant model in San Francisco, for example, and how do we share all of that knowledge? So it's a big focus of internally how we operate is sharing the different speeds at which different regions work and the different expertise we have. It allows us to avoid having experts in the same field everywhere, and we're very nimble at being able to draw in, convention center expert in Melbourne and applying it to a project in Abu Dhabi or wherever. And that's really the way that we try and work. And we sort of call that our global studio model, that instead of it being 17 individual locations, we're all sort of trying to work together and navigate all the challenges organizationally that come along with that. The other angle to our sort of broad expertise and our sort of broad experience, both globally, but is also across sectors. So we tend to cut that knowledge in two different directions, whether it's regional and local and understanding the context and how that applies and how we can deploy it, but then also understanding what's happening in different sectors and how we can apply different movements between things. So, for example, I look after a lot of residential work in the UK. So when Build to Rent started developing sort of 10 years ago, we really focused on that. And now we're seeing that start to happen in Australia. So how do we share that sectoral knowledge globally as well as the regional application of it so that it's appropriate? What that all does is gives us a really good exposure to seeing global shifts and what's happening across the world, and how that all is moving from both a client perspective, but also from what we're seeing across our studios. Again, just hammering home the idea of this people architecture piece is really important to us. It's about the people experiencing the architecture. It's not just about the expression of architecture for architect's sake that's important to us. So that's our real focus. To pick up on the topic of today, the global shifts and looking at net zero, I thought I would draw on a case study from Australia in Tasmania. This is the University of Tasmania Southern Campus, the Forestry and Timber Yards buildings, which are going to include the Business and Economics School, the Law School, and then also the some of the university corporate services in there. So it's a real mix of formal and informal spaces. It also includes some academic and corporate workspace, and then there's a commercial tenancy as part of as well. So that mix of uses really comes together, and our understanding of being able to jump between those sectors. So everything from education to workplace to placemaking all coming together into a project like this. And probably the key thing that really underpins it, and it's similar to exactly what Tony and Darren have talked about in their presentations, is this reuse and retention of buildings. So this project relies on retaining a heritage building and another building adjacent to it, and then really drawing them together into a single new campus element with some additions and extensions, and then refitting the internal spaces to deliver the single use or the combined use of the overall building at the end of the project. One of the key briefs from the client was to connect the broader city back into the campus and open up the campus to the city, which then reflected back into the sustainability strategy and the net zero strategy of bringing nature into the city, because you end up with this back and forth between bringing the city in, but then can we bring the biophilic and biodiversity back into this project, and then conversely expand that back out into the city. Part of that then developed into these 4 key overarching strategies around sustainability: water efficiency, high performance fixtures, how do we use rainwater, how do we reuse water where we can, fairly self-contained; biodiversity, so bringing that landscape really right deep into the building and into the spaces so that people can experience them. And then probably the 2 that are the other ones that I'll focus on now, which is a low carbon impact, both operational, but also through the construction, the development of the project, and then a material strategy that also supports that low carbon approach. In terms of thinking about the carbon impact, we studied the whole life carbon emissions for the building. Now, I'm not an expert in this, so don't challenge me in too much detail on whole life carbon calculations. That's not my expertise, but obviously we understand that there are some sort of key moments for architects where we can have a big impact on the carbon usage of the building, particularly in construction selection products and processes and how we do that. But then also considering that long-term operational, the sort of long tail of the carbon impact that we have on the project, and how we take that forward through understanding that we have those big moments of impact, but then long-term, which is a slightly different focus. The project was lucky enough to have the two existing buildings to rely on, so there was a lot of retention. And again, similar to what both Tony and Darren were talking about, is just how much of those can we retain and not change and simply add to where we needed to. So that gave us a really good foot up. But this, the embodied carbon for the project was assessed at 430 kilos per square metre, which is about a 45% reduction compared to REBA's benchmark target of 800. So that gave us real comfort, and that was achieved through lots of the strategies that Darren was talking about in terms of thinking about how the replaced roof structure became a mass timber structure, which is incredibly relevant contextually for Tasmania with their forestry process, and also the client obviously being a forestry building made perfect sense. And then also thinking about where we did have to use cement and more intensive carbon elements, how do we do cement replacement and things like that, and use different materials, which leads on to that circular material strategy, which is thinking about, again, exactly as Darren mentioned, hemp. Can we use hempcrete blocks to replace our anything that might be traditional masonry, and also testing and using different materials like this hemp hurd finish. And on the left, you can see a test there where we're seeing, does it work as a finish? How can we use it? But also the variations in it, and how can we use the natural variations in these materials as part of the design and as part of the expression of what we were trying to achieve with the building. So in this case, we're using the variation of where the hemp is harvested and the different conditions that it's grown in will actually give variations to the colour that we see at the end. Not quite as strong as this test from talking to the team. This was that was a much more extreme test that they were doing there, but it'll have those variations as part of that, and we really enjoy that, exposing that in the design as we go through. But that strategy continued not just at the construction stage, but also all the way through to furniture selection, and how do we have a strategy for considering what products are appropriate to put in a building that's trying to achieve a net zero outcome. So there was a number of selection considerations pulled across all of it, and then a really simple icon system, so that as we're talking to the client about the various selections and the options available, you can really easily see which ones are ticking the box and which ones aren't. And I think, to Ben's point, sort of EPDs and getting into furniture and products and what they are actually composed of, you get into a lot of detail very quickly that's hard to then navigate unless you're really have a really educated client who's excited and wants to get into that level of detail. So again, trying to find ways of simplifying that decision-making process so that we can see the strategy through in a realistic and practical way, instead of it sort of being a wrapper over the top. On a different perspective, and picking up one of the other points that was in the summary for today's session, is thinking about international priorities. Now, obviously, we've got this really broad footprint. We work in a lot of different regions, a lot of different parts of the world, and have clients from even wider parts of the world. So we get a really good exposure as to what we're seeing consistently. I think it's been really interesting hearing between Tony, Darren, and ourselves that focus on what the people are experiencing, connection to nature, bringing those elements together and showing that in the buildings that we're working on seems to be a consistent theme of how sustainability and net zero targets and all those things are starting to manifest in architecture. But obviously, with our wide portfolio, we have all of these different projects from all over the world with different, studios with different people from different regions designing them and pulling them together in all these different contexts. But there's this hopefully underlying thread that comes through, not in a design language or a design aesthetic, but in the approach that then delivers spaces that people really enjoy being part of, experiencing and coming together in. And how do we see clients driving that? And I thought I'd start a bit of a discussion topic. I don't have a closed resolved thesis on this, but I thought probably the busiest market that we're seeing globally architecturally at the moment is Saudi Arabia. There's obviously, questions and challenges about how and when and what work architects should be doing, and how we should be engaging with that. I don't have a good answer for that either, so I'm not going to delve into it in too much detail. But just when you look at the scale and the ambition and the targets and what they're trying to achieve in Saudi Arabia, it's quite exciting, but it's quite staggering. And you see these sort of 14 giga projects, of which we're exposed to a number of them in terms of some of our work and our involvement, and just seeing that the absolute different ends of the scale that they have between super futuristic, very particular vision for NEOM, all the way through to, domestic and internal market housing and everything in between, these real different collections of styles. And you start to look at how much of the architectural industry is currently engaged in work in this region that's all effectively being delivered through a single giant client with a number of arms in the detail. And you start to think, how much of an impact is that having on the global architectural industry? And there's sort of been flippant comments about them having their own architectural movement coming off the back of all of this work, and that they're driving change in terms of the way architects are thinking about space. I think that's, there's something in that, but it's not necessarily as quiet driving. But I just thought this is an interesting world to start thinking about when you've got such a volume of work all happening and occupying such a proportion of global architecture's attention and time, and I found in working in projects in Saudi Arabia, they have their own way of procuring and delivering projects. And so that's slightly at odds with the REBA stages. And so then how are we changing the way we work to accommodate that, and how much of an impact that will have on the industry as a whole, I think is a topic of discussion that would be interesting to pick up, and for the industry to think about how such a huge volume of work in one part of the world, with ultimately one eye across it at the very top of the process, how does that start to dictate what people are thinking about and how the profession is moving forward, is an interesting topic of discussion. So I just thought I'd raise that as a bit of a conversation starter at the end of the presentation here, and hopefully we can dive into that and covering everything else as we get into the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon. Really interesting question there at the end. Tony and Darren, did you have any thoughts on that question that Simon raised about a huge market like Saudi Arabia driving change in the way that the industry works?
It's incredibly interesting, isn't it? And some of those projects are on a scale so vast, it's difficult to comprehend. We're not working actively in Saudi Arabia at the moment, but we have had opportunities. And as a B Corp, but as kind of what we would like to call kind of real world architects that don't sit on a pedestal and judge, actually want to get in and help resolve problems. It's a real difficulty for us, and I don't have the answer at the moment. But as a B Corp, every project that comes in, we are now kind of assessing on its merits and any concerns we might have ethically, sustainability about that project, and making a decision on a kind of project by project basis. And it's an evolving mindset, and we don't have all of the answers right now, but I think it's raising some interesting questions for sure.
Yeah, I think going back to where Simon started as well there, with you being very sort of people-centric approach to architecture, and the challenge of the work in Saudi Arabia is so many of these places are entirely new. The people, the place has not yet been created, and with much of our work having developed in sort of Northern Europe and European context, we're rarely presented with such a blank canvas. I think that now these opportunities in Saudi Arabia are happening, and across the Middle East, where there are these blank canvases and people trying to create a place and a vision. I suppose we had this with North America 200 years ago, 150 years ago, new places and what is a new city, how you create a city. We've had it in the UK with garden cities and things. So it's not entirely fresh concept, but it is of a scale that I don't think the world has seen, and it is an interesting way to work. Up in northern Sweden, it's probably our nearest context that we might be working with that, where we're looking to relocate a town up in Kiruna, because that's being it's because of the mining industry in the area. There's some underpinning work happening. Essentially, the town is sinking into the mine, and they've chosen to relocate the entire town. So we did the master plan for that. but we were able to grasp on there was a place, and it was how you capture that place and move that place, retain that identity, and look for it to grow, attracting future generations. Whereas, it's a much wider question, much more open. Who are those future occupiers? Where are they coming from? Is it an international city that's being created? Is it a local city that's being created?
I suppose. Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Simon.
I was going to say, I think you've picked up on a good point, Darren, because there is a whole, beyond the blank canvas challenge of what is this place that we're designing for. It's a great opportunity to be able to explore that, but then also there is this sort of two-face of it. There is this very international-facing series of projects that are of, sort of insane scale and the pace at which they're trying to deliver all of these things concurrently. But there is this suite of projects that are all actually quite internal-facing and domestic-facing that I find quite interesting. The sort of Saudi downtown project where it's about delivering, X thousand, upgraded city centres across the country, and this internal domestic-facing market that is where I find that quite interesting about how do you balance the ambition of, a NEOM or a Qiddiya or whatever against this, how do we actually deliver housing for locals in a way that modernizes it and they enjoy it and take part of. It's a really interesting, two ends of the spectrum to deal with as well. And how do you take really well-worn, really well-understood urban principles from cities like, London and others and apply that, but regionally, appropriately is a real fascinating conversation as well.
I suppose to sort of flip the question on its head a little bit, I was just wondering to what extent you think the industry is helping shape or focus clients' priorities in contexts where perhaps there's a perception of less emphasis on sustainability or those ESG priorities.
I think that's one I think we've found quite interesting, and I would say within our sort of focus of sustainability, it has been very industry-led in many ways. I think there's been a reaction from public, there's a reaction from industry, there's a reaction from government and regulation, and government process takes a lot longer to work through. If we look at net zero standards, for example, obviously LETI is a grassroots organisation, yet we'll all refer to LETI targets, and REBA refers to LETI targets, and then central government refers to REBA, and it's referential, but it's actually grassroots activism almost that's taken hold, that's really driven the standards, because people realise that there might be an aspiration set, but then to get that as something tangible that people can work with and understand, there has been things come in to fill that void. So we started with sustainability being a conversation that we were pushing, and everyone looks at you a little bit strange, like, okay, but I want it to look really good and be X, Y, and Z. And now it is more mainstream, but I do think it has come from an approach of the wider public as well, not just architects, but public generally being more aware of these issues and challenging these issues. You see how when there's a public understanding of a problem, it can react very quickly. We take fire regulations in Grenfell. There was an incident in the UK there that everyone latched onto. They saw it, and very quickly government regulation responded to this because there was a public understanding of something. And when something so instantaneous happens that we just have to respond, we do.
Yeah, I guess the challenge is responding on a greater degree when at the moment, that there isn't quite as much urgency as there might have been around something like Grenfell. And I think the level of influence, Ben, to come back to your question, probably depends upon the client. And I think, the majority of clients have good intentions around most things, but are they in a position to see those things through, and are they in a position to realise their aspirations? And I think the challenge becomes more and more prevalent when, as I said earlier, you're dealing with existing built form, and how many buildings, across the UK, across the globe are existing. They're going to be here in 2030. It's only 6 years away. And how many of those landlord owners actually have the capital and the ability to make the changes they need to make within that short period of time? I think that's the real challenge.
Simon, did you have any thoughts?
I think it's a really interesting question, and if I put my sort of cynical hat on, I would say to Darren and Tony's point, I think architects have been pushing the barrow for a long time now in terms of it being something that architects have felt is important and that we need to push. And unfortunately, it's been the sort of shift in the recent years where suddenly the funders it's important to banks and funders that suddenly it's not oh, this is a nice to have, it's we won't get funding unless we can prove we're doing this, and then suddenly it's a high priority. So I think that kind of the grassroots piece has meant that architects are perfectly positioned to be able to deliver that, because we've sort of been thinking about it and diving into it and pushing it for a while, and now that the landscape has shifted, it's suddenly meant that it's come to the fore, which is fantastic. So it's just finding a way to keep that going, I think, and what other things can we push, and like you say, bring to the public awareness even more, that starts to mean expectations just move along with it across the market.
So there's a whole sort of shift in finance being asked to sort of put an emphasis on ESG. Is that something you're seeing across the board, or is it, can you identify specific markets, client bases where this is having an impact?
I mean, I think we're seeing it as a global shift in terms of project demand, client demand, in terms of, particularly in the UK, very much so. And I think you start to get to other sort of more developing markets, and it's even there becoming an expectation that it will achieve certain levels of sustainability as just part and parcel of doing the project now. So I think we are seeing it as a global demand. It obviously varies in extent around the world, but compared to 10, 15 years ago when I moved to London, coming from working on Green Star buildings in Australia and then coming to London and asking about sustainability strategies, and the answer kind of being the client's not interested. So we keep doing what we're doing. And that, I think that culture has shifted dramatically in the last 5 or 8 years, which is good to see, because it just frees us up to really explore it a little bit further.
I think just to bring in, Ben, as well, what Darren said is that it's almost like it's coming from both directions. So there's absolutely this kind of investment agenda, but equally there's this widespread public awareness. So, occupiers are only going to occupy your building if it meets certain credentials. That's from a commercial and from a residential perspective. People are generally expecting more. They will call you out if they see that you're not doing what you should be doing. So I think it's coming from both sides, and that's why clients are forced to respond.
Is there a significant difference, do you think, between the priorities of domestic clients and international ones when in the UK context, but anywhere, in terms of their sort of long and short term agendas?
I think there's a difference between international and domestic clients. Can be the same about where their investment is, because there can be domestic clients that are internationally funded, that are working from hedge funds around the world, that have whatever backing behind them. There can be international clients that are investing in a long-term estate regeneration that's got multiple phases. They'll be developing for 10 years, and they want to make a place that will sell in 10 years' time. And they know that a place that will sell in 10 years' time is a place that has created more than just, we have supplied homes. We actually need to create a community. They want to invest in it. They look long-term. So I think it's very hard to split out in any major projects between a domestic and an international market, because we work in such a global society. It might be a UK-backed finance that's also got behind it finance from wherever, that has behind it finance from wherever, and things. So there is no such thing as a domestic project, I would say, unless it is of a domestic scale, and that very small scale. I think whenever we get onto large projects, it's very hard to find what a fully domestic project is.
I think the only differentiator that I've personally seen is kind of the level of engagement with the community varies between clients, and the level of engagement in the project. If you're dealing with a client that is internationally based, sometimes there is less of a hands-on approach, a kind of less of a hands-on social value community building type agenda than clients that, even if they're internationally funded, have more kind of physical base in the location that you're talking about. I think that's the real only difference that I've seen.
I've got a question from one of the attendees. In the pursuit of net zero in the built environment globally, how much onus do the speakers feel is on architects? How can architects lead the way and promote client and wider industry buy-in?
Shall I start?
Yes, please, Darren. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for us, it's really, as architects, we kind of need to understand the full implication of decisions and things. I think it's very easy to, at early stages, be proposing X, Y, and Z, but actually know how clients and people are able to deliver that, and that this product or whatever material that we're driving, or however we're driving that sustainable agenda, know how that is going to affect the clients and how that is really implementable for them. When you're dealing with a building that's a high fire risk, you're understanding that from the outset, and you know, okay, this is how it can control how my decision making can happen there. And I think the more knowledge we have as clients, as architects, will help in that process. It's like clients look to us to be like, okay, what is my sustainable thing, and how can I achieve it? Like, they don't want their pie in the sky sustainable building. They don't want their pie in the sky, oh, we're going to build everything from this. But it's actually understanding how you can achieve the best output for that client and for that project. And I do think that comes from us that put it on the table. They might not even know something's on the table unless an architect or one of their design team presents an option. It might not have even considered beforehand.
I agree with that, but I do think it needs to be a collaboration. You know, architects are not going to be able to do this alone. It needs a whole industry initiative. You know, the way that the industry is set up in the UK at the moment, you know, architecture over the years has kind of slightly diluted a lot of the control that we have. So that's why it needs to be all parties. I mean, we need to have kind of greater connections to the supply chain, you know, contractors, clients, architects, engineers. It needs to be a collaborative effort at the end of the day. And there needs to be kind of more transparency and more joined up activity throughout the whole process of a project. You know, quite often it'll start with one design team, maybe up to a certain stage, then it'll hand on to someone else, then it'll go D&B, and so there needs to be a much more joined up approach, in my opinion. And you know, the Building Safety Act is an interesting one to see how that goes, because I think that process that's in place by the Building Safety Act will be a step forward in some ways, in terms of that kind of more rigid, transparent kind of monitoring of specifications, materials, etc.
And I think that architects play a big piece in giving clients comfort. So to Darren's point as well, in terms of bringing new things to the table, but also needing to have done enough research that what is typically a fairly risk-averse client who's very comfortable with a concrete frame, with a traditional facade system, all of the things they're used to, that as soon as you start saying alternate systems, the initial reaction is, well, unless we understand how it's going to perform in 20 years' time and what the impacts of this going on, it's a bit scary. It could be more expensive. All of the sort of disagreements come out. It's about finding ways that you allay those fears, I think, with clients, so that it's less of a risk and they can see that it's understood, and they understand how this is going to work long term and equivalent to things that they are more comfortable and more used to. And the same goes with discussions with contractors and everyone in the whole delivery chain, so that you don't have huge amounts of premium added on because it's something different than what everyone's used to, because the sort of immediate reaction is if it's different, it's more expensive, which is not necessarily the case in a lot of these products. It is really just about getting the more widespread use of them, so that it's less scary, I guess, as something different and new.
Thank you so much, everybody. I've got lots more questions, but unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. So thank you so much for your time, and for those who've attended as well and asked questions online. I just wanted to reiterate that the recording will be available in an hour, and also that there are 2 more sessions later today. Also, for those who are attending online, please do provide your feedback in the pop-up at the conclusion of the session. And do feel free to make suggestions about topics that you'd like to see us cover on future events. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for those attending online, and thank you very much for our presenters today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.